you dummy. If you had any fucking heart at all, you'd be out fucking stealing for a living.
Mafia member Nikki Slick DiPietro is an inmate at a medium correctional facility in Pennsylvania serving a life term for a crime he did not commit. That's the contention anyway. And there's reason to believe he was set up by none other than the FBI, who are protecting the real killer because the man is allegedly a confidential informant. The case possibly echoes past FBI informants such as Whitey Bulger and Greg the Grim Reaper Scarpa. Crime writer Nick Christophers has contacted DiPietro and learned the inside story of how he was born into the life and found himself involved with many of Philadelphia's more famous mafia gangsters. He's also obtained personal photos that show DiPietro with some of his associates, including famous Banano killer Tommy Karate Pitiera. The question is not whether Slick was heavily involved with the mafia. He was. In fact, he calls himself a gangster. But if he's been in jail 20 years for a murder he didn't commit, doesn't he deserve the chance to start over? If there are serious questions about how the government handled his case, doesn't he deserve a new trial? And if the FBI is corruptly protecting yet another mafia ally, essentially giving the real killer a license to kill, shouldn't this be exposed? That Nicky would end up in the life was almost inevitable because of his family and because of the South Philly neighborhood he grew up in. His uncle was mob associate Philip J. McFillin, a.k.a. Phil Disney, or Phil Mo, a close friend and frequent companion of late mob boss Little Nicky Scarfo. DiPietro grew up in a South Philly neighborhood among all the mobsters who stood on street corners like so many light posts. These gangsters had an allure that was difficult to resist for kids, hoping to emulate them. Boys growing up in that neighborhood watched the guys in Cadillacs and Lincolns parking wherever they wanted. They saw the pinky rings and beautiful women. They observed men that never waited for a table in a restaurant and were treated with deference on the street. DiPietro's father was street tough, so between him and Disney, Slick had mentors that would introduce him to key players in organized crime. Slick earned his nickname as a boy with a sly gift for stealing. He became part of the infamous 10th and O gang. Founded in the 60s, the gang's name stems from the street corner at 10th Street and Oregon Avenue. The gang is independent from the Philadelphia Cosa Nostra family, but often acts as a farm system for future mafioso. Operating out of bars and social clubs, the gang is involved in narcotics, trafficking, loan sharking, extortion, and gambling. Though the 10th and O gang developed future-made men for La Cosa Nostra, they also at times clashed with the official family or took sides with one faction or another. In fact, at one time they attempted to eliminate legendary and alleged current mob boss Skinny Joe Merlino. Slick's father had the nickname Richie Nigga. Growing up, Nicky would see the wad of hundreds his dad always carried around, wrapped in a rubber band. Richie was clever enough to drive a Nissan, but his wife boasted a Cadillac. He explained to his son that the Nissan drew less attention and still got him from A to B. But Richie enjoyed plenty of other toys, including a boat he acquired from the murdered Frank Sindone, motorcycles, snowmobiles, and a summer house on the shore. His father got teenage Slick work, cleaning the club of famed mobster Salvi Testa, and his dad had several cops on the payroll and ran one of the biggest card games in the city. However, Slick is burdened with the guilt that he somehow let his dad down, considering himself, quote, a rotten son. But this seems a somewhat harsh self-judgment, considering that DiPietro's life of crime seemed all but inevitable, in part due to a family influence. At the end of the day, it's not about feelings of guilt. For these kids were products of their environment, and that environment developed during a time when Italians could not count on the law to protect them, or on safety nets to support them when their luck went sour. What's more important now is to end the cycle of crime and violence. Many Italian gangsters are now successfully turning to entrepreneurial business ventures. Even Skinny Joe Merlino opened a restaurant. What would Slick himself do with a second chance? It could go either way, but if he's in jail for a murder he didn't commit, after 20 years he deserves a new trial and perhaps a fresh start. However, avoiding a return to the life would be a challenge, considering it's all he's ever known. During his youth, his father took him down to Florida with fellow wise guys Saul Kane, his Uncle Phil, and Tommy Del Giorno, where they partied with little Nicky Scarfo on his yacht. It was an eye-widening experience for Slick as they stayed at the Swank Diplomat Hotel in Fort Lauderdale. And somehow Richie Nigga came back with an extra $9,000 in cash. His son was absorbing all of this. Slick got a little piece of this action and used it to buy every kid in the schoolyard pretzels, sodas at recess. He got a taste of what it felt like to be a big shot, and that taste was sweet. As a young man still wanting to be the big shot, he used to flash Scarfo business cards in clubs until his father and Scarfo himself told him to knock it off. His old man was also connected to the well-known pool room owner and numbers runner Frankie Flowers. Richie himself was a legendary pool player in the neighborhood. Through Frankie, Richie knew all the heavy bookmakers like Joe Lingambi, Frank Sindone, Chicky Narducci, and Buster Calicero. He was also partners with Georgie Stump Mortaletti. So Nikki Slick grew up buddies alongside the next generation of Philly gangsters, such as Mark Scarfo, Georgie Borghese, Johnny Gongs, and Johnny Hendry. These were tough characters, and Nikki Slick was as tough as any. To an apprentice member of La Cosa Nostra, going to college means doing time in prison. This is where a young gangster makes more connections and continues his education about the life. Nikki Slick caught a few pinches in the early days and did bits in Marion, Illinois, with the likes of John Gotti and little Nicky Scarfo. Scarfo, in fact, helped enhance Slick's stature by referring to him as his nephew, even though there was no blood relation. It was while serving these sentences that Slick was officially inducted into the life as a made man by none other than Gotti himself. The ceremony was conducted in a prison chapel. Of course, mafia bosses always have themselves in mind, and their secret induction of Slick was no exception. According to the reporting of Nick Christophers, inside the chapel, Gotti told Nicky Slick this: "Today you are reborn. You answer to your uncle and only to your uncle. Don't tell anybody about this. We will introduce you as a friend of ours when the time is right. Because if nobody knows you are straightened out, nobody will think you are a threat. So when we tell you to strike, nobody will know what hit them." Making guys like this in prison is not the norm for La Cosa Nostra, so Scarfo felt the need to justify it. Back in Philadelphia, Sicilian John Stanford was then running the family, and according to the old bosses, Scarfo and Gotti, Stanford was making a muck of regular mafia inductions. Stanford had made the mistake of allowing a corrupt former cop, Ron Praviti, into the family, a man who turned out to be a rat working with the feds. So Gotti and Scarfo argued that being inducted by two family bosses who were on the commission no less, was more legitimate than any inductions done by the ruling family in Philly. Now let's get to the night that changed Nikki Slick's life forever, landing him in prison where he'll spend the rest of his days if he's not granted a new trial. February 29th, 2000, South Philadelphia. A typical night of bouncing around the city's nightclubs for Nicky and three associates. But this was more than the usual carousing. For Nikki Slick, according to the mafia writer Christopher's, was on the clock. Meaning this was a hit. Slick and two of the men in his foursome had been assigned to kill the fourth member of the group, a man who goes by the nickname Blondie. We don't know when or exactly how the gangsters intended to eliminate Blondie that night. They never got the chance. In a twist worthy of a Hollywood thriller, Blondie unintentionally eliminated Slick by landing him in prison for life. The group arrived at Club Deco. According to court documents, Slick and one of the others came in through a front door where there was a metal detector and a bouncer patting people down. This meant Slick and his companion were unarmed. Blondie and his companion came in through a back door. Think of the scene in Goodfellas where Henry Hill takes his date through the kitchen. But the four gangsters found each other inside the club and partied. Eventually, Blondie got into a heated argument on the dance floor with a man named Tad Green over money. Green was refusing to pay what he owed. With Slick backing him up, suddenly Blondie took 2 steps back, produced a pistol, and shot Green. In the pandemonium that erupted, Blondie handed Slick the weapon as they fled the club. Slick tossed it outside. Witnesses pointed to the gangsters in their vehicle as they fled, and police managed to pull them over. 3 guns were found inside. At the hospital, Green died strangely without being interviewed by police. Back at the club, police questioned witnesses. All of them described the shooter as 6 feet tall, blonde, and wearing a blue Yankee bomber jacket. Only Blondie met this description. DiPietro absolutely did not. However, none of those witnesses and none of those statements ever reached the jury. Now, one might be tempted to think, so what? They got another mobster off the street. But when the government acts like an organized crime family itself, it's not just mafia hoods that end up victims. Any one of us can. Take, for example, the January 6th storming of the Capitol. Many of those held behind bars in brutal conditions for over a year waiting trial did nothing more than enter the building. You might be tempted to think those deluded Trumpsters are getting what they deserve. But what happens when power again shifts in Washington and the government starts coming after your side? What happens if they start throwing pro-choice protesters or Black Lives Matter marchers in jail with excessive sentences, or even worse, to language in squalor without a trial for over a year? We here at Yellow Cottage don't cater to one side of the political aisle or the other. It's about equal justice. It's about following the laws. And that's what applies to the case of Nikki Slick. He's not in prison for being a gangster. He's in prison for murder. If he didn't commit the murder, he deserves justice. The same justice you or I deserve. It's happened before. In Massachusetts, in 2001, 2 mafia associates were released from prison where they were serving life for murder. They had been in jail 33 years, along with 2 other falsely convicted men who died in prison. Evidence had emerged that the 4 had been framed by the FBI, who were trying to protect gangsters they were in business with. In the Boston case in the 60s, a member of the Bonanno crime family in New York, Teddy Deegan, was working the Massachusetts area, robbing members of the Patriarca crime family, which ruled New England from Providence. So the Patriarchas put out the hit on him. The contract was given to Vincent Flemmi and Joseph Barboza, who, using their contracts with the Deegan's friends, set up the hit. Deegan was found in an alleyway, dead from shots from multiple guns. A report went to the FBI head, J. Edgar Hoover, that Joseph Barboza, Vincent Flemmi, Ronnie the Pig Casesso, and Wilfred Roy French were behind the hit. But FBI agents conspired with Barboza, Casesso, and French to set up 4 men to take the fall. These 4 innocent men were mafia associates, but were not involved in the killing of Deegan. The only evidence pointing at these men was the testimony of Barboza and his allies, testimony which not only proved to be manufactured, but done with the help of FBI agent H. Paul Rico and others. Why did the FBI do it? Corrupt FBI relationships with the mob occur on 2 levels. On one, the FBI develops informants which feed them information. With low-level gangsters involved in nonviolent crimes, this might be justified as the FBI uses the information to protect the public by getting more serious criminals off the street. However, as we've seen over and over, such as with White Bulger in Boston or Greg Scarpa in New York, these agents often protect very violent gangsters that are helping them out. Essentially, they give the protected gangster a license to kill. With FBI protection, the gangster rises much more quickly within the criminal organization, as he's able to use the government to eliminate rivals. The agents benefit by using the info to achieve highly prominent arrests, and they too rise through their organization. Often relationships of this type involve the government paying their informant substantial sums of money. Occasionally, these FBI relationships just involve plain old corruption. The gangsters pay their FBI handlers a lot of cash for information and protection. Some of these FBI agents even begin to dress like the gangsters they admire. In the Deegan case, the FBI agents were willing to let 4 mafia associates rot in jail with life sentences for a murder they did not commit. They figured they were getting the bad guys off the street, while keeping their informants on the street. A win-win in their view. The question raised here by Nick Christophers is whether a similar thing happened to Nikki Slick. Is this why witnesses disappeared and witnesses' statements were not allowed? There were 3 witnesses slated to testify, and all were expected to say that the killer was a blonde man in a blue bomber jacket. One of these witnesses, a young woman, didn't show up at court. Who scared her off? Another witness completely changed his original testimony so that he fell in line with the government's case. That could be a clue as to who was scaring witnesses. A third witness gave statements that would have been exculpatory for Slick, but the government hid these from his defense attorney. The government refused to hand over witnesses' statements, such as those recorded by the FBI, under the argument that witnesses needed to be protected. But who was the FBI really protecting? Was it Blondie, who, according to Christophers, is a known drug dealer who has magically managed to avoid ever serving time over his more than 20-year criminal career? The question is why the FBI was involved in this state case to begin with. They have over 2,000 pages of FBI files, known as 302s, on the man who we are referring to as Blondie. After a previous report authored by Christophers in another crime journal, the man we are calling Blondie reached out in anger to the writer. It's understandable why. In that world, tagging someone as an FBI cooperator, a rat, can bring a death sentence. But Christophers was also contacted by another underworld figure who backed up the reporting, claiming Blondie had been an informant with the FBI for 20 years. Nikki Slick has always been maintained in his innocence, but has refused to give evidence about the shooter, as he views cooperation with the government as a violation of his oath. Slick was in the headlines again in 2015, a very bizarre case where he pleaded guilty to threatening a woman who developed a relationship with him when he was in jail. Debbie Weibel, who took on the alias Dixie Diamonds, had always been obsessed with gangsters and wanted nothing more than to marry one. In her late 40s at the time, she sent letters to various mafia prisoners, eventually developing a relationship with Nicky, who smelled opportunity. To first win her trust, Slick sent her almost $5,000 to buy them both engagement rings. Having won her trust, she herself then began pumping money into his account, eventually putting in $41,000. She paid his legal bills, tried to help him obtain a divorce, and even bought a cemetery plot with tombstones, which she had engraved with her and Slick's names. A photo of the tombstone that DiPietro brought to the hearing shows it inscribed with the names Dixie Diamonds, wife and mole, and little Nikki Slick, husband and friend. Eventually, Nikki Slick tried to make sure his mole kept sending him money by threatening to put a hit on her. Where it gets interesting as far as government corruption is that they tried to smear Slick as a cooperator or a rat. The foundation of this claim was a lie Slick told Weibel in order to get her to pump more money into his prison account. Slick had to convince his wannabe mole that he was soon going to get out. After all, he was in prison on a lifetime sentence, and Weibel was in the market for a mafia husband, not just a pen pal. So DiPietro told her that he had cut a deal with the government in order to be set free. All part of the scam with no truth behind it, yet the government purposely leaked this information in a way intended to make Slick seem like a rat. Were they hoping he would flip for real? Or were they still protecting someone else? Or perhaps even protecting themselves, for if the mafia killed Slick in prison, the truth of FBI corruption in that case might never come out. Obviously, Nikki Slick is no Boy Scout. But would he return to a life of crime? If he actually did kill Tad Green, he deserves to remain in prison for life. But if he did not, he deserves a chance at redemption. A chance to use his hustling skills to enter the legitimate business world, as many former mobsters have done. And if the matter of his guilt or innocence is unsettled, he deserves a fair trial. A new trial. Please help this new channel out with its investigating and reporting by clicking subscribe and like. Check out below for links to Nick Christopher's fine books and articles on the mafia.